Okay, welcome back, students and curious people out in the world. This is a continuing lecture in a series. If you're following me on Patreon or through CCC Theory, I'm simultaneously teaching a course currently at a university here in Denver uh, called Race and Power in U.S. History, and these lectures are doing some double duty work there. If you are a student, you've been assigned the 1619 project, you should be about uh, you should be a couple of essays in, right? The first essay from Nicole Hannah-Jones on democracy, and then Dorothy Roberts on race. And my previous lecture video was on slave codes and race and making the broad sort of connection that what we first see happening with colonization is that it moves from a religious othering, like who is a Christian and who is not. And that ties into emergent international law, the Doctrine of Discovery, which is the a lecture video before that. And increasingly we get this shift away from the term Christian, non-Christian, and the emergence of the racialized language, where whiteness emerges as a legal concept, where Africans are being African slaves are a lineage is being traced through the mother's belly. That was in a previous lecture video. 1662, and so we get the slave codes from Barbados coming into the northern continent. But of course, slavery had already been legalized by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1641, following the Pequot War, as well. And so throughout the 17th century, the 1600s, right, we get the emergence of racialized law that then comes to spread and dominate around the globe, right? So, it's not that people didn't notice different nations before, didn't notice skin color before, but what we see with this new emergence of modern racism, we see it tied to chattel slavery, so where slaves are being seen in a completely dehumanized form as property. And that word chattel comes from the same word as cattle for us, right? So you can think of it like that, that it really is African slaves were being treated um, just like cattle. So to even use the word mother for that tracing the lineage through a mother, that's a bit of a stretch. The relationship to if you're enslaved to people that you might be biologically your children might be totally destroyed by the relationship with the person who owns you. Uh, so now in this lecture, I want to give a different take on some of the main events of the 1600s. So the 1619 project does a really, really good job, and so I'm accenting that here. So I'm expecting that you, if you're in my classes anyway, that you've read that stuff, and then this should be like a whole bunch of extra and really interesting information on top of those essays. So let me get my PowerPoint going here. Uh, I'm going to talk mostly about uh, these two big events. So I already talked about the Pequot War, and I'm going to talk about a couple of other um, conflicts that happen with King Metacom or King Philip's War, and Bacon's rebellion in this lecture. So both of these conflicts happen in the 1670s, but they're drawing on earlier tensions. And I want to drop back into some stuff I just haven't been able to cover in previous lectures, just to kind of frame things a little bit better. So let me play this slideshow from the start. And get my face out of the way of Usamakin's face. Um, this is not Metacom here. This image, this is his father, Usamakin, who we will talk about in the lectures here. So, like I said, I want to go into some earlier stuff that hasn't been covered, and this is again, it is not to criticize the 1619 Project too much. I feel like it's a really good book, but what we see is like every historian is going to have their own angle that they bring to things, and the editors of 1619 Project are particularly emphasizing African American history and African American context as um, essential to the contributions to the foundation of the United States as a nation state that comes later on, right? And history, and they are completely correct in that. So, if I make little critiques or say things in this lecture, it is not to shoot them down because I feel like some people politically want to shoot down what they're talking about in their book. And what I'm going to say is that one of the things that their book just isn't really able to do, as well as someone like I would like, is covering indigenous context, right? So Native American context, and that's like where my background and not personally background, but my scholarly background comes from as we go into this stuff. So I'm hoping to accent that, right? It's, if the course that you've taken is called Multicultural America or Race and Power in the U.S. History, I'm giving you a lot of different voices. That's the point, right, for the class. So let's go on. I'm going to jump back to some earlier context because what uh, I will say in being a little bit weak on indigenous issues for the 1619 project. What it also shows is that they're reacting to what I would call the stock story of the ways that or the dominant narrative, the ways that the foundations of the United States has been told. And because they're reacting to that, they almost have that story in mind. So I want to emphasize this notion of stock story and counter story here. All forms of history are always revisionist history. So I'm gonna put that kind of thing aside, right? I live in Colorado, where there's a street named after John Evans, who is an early governor of the territory, and later state that becomes Colorado. And then they rename a mountain called Mount Evans here, or Pikes Peak, right? All of these places have indigenous names to them beforehand. And so like making statues, taking statues down, all of those kinds of conflicts that we might have about street names and all of this sort of stuff. And whether or not we're preserving or history of all of this stuff is going to fall under what history itself does, right? Every kind of history is telling a kind of particular narrative, and it will have its perspectives to it. And the attempt we want to, of course, try to be generous to as many perspectives as we can. Um, uh, but no one gets to be completely objective when it comes to these things. So, one of the techniques that indigenous scholars give us is this technique called a view from the shore. This is what Steve Newcomb, who has this great film called Doctrine of Discovery, or he has a book called Pagans in the Promised Land, and which is a really great book from about 2008 on Fortress Press, if I remember right. And there's a film from about 2015 that he did with Sheldon Wolfchild, who's a Dakota filmmaker, that they present a lot of the information in a video form that's really compelling. Sometimes I show it to my classes. So Newcomb get advances among others, but Newcomb is who I've been using in class. Advances the idea of like how do we think about like the history of what people now call the North American continent or Turtle Island, as a view from the shore. Um, do you come to this video or to this lecture with an idea that America starts in the East and moves slowly west? That kind of narrative. That's a really ideological narrative that happens. I'm characterizing it as kind of stock story, but it's telling the story of the dominant class that comes to situations. But and that's what the 1619 project is kind of reacting against. And so we see that they're um, emphasizing, even with that. year 1619, they're emphasizing this arrival of captives from Africa, of slaves from Africa, and a pirate ship, right? That lands in what was then called Virginia by the colonizers, right? But of course, not Virginia to the native peoples. At the same time, we have to remember, and this is something that they don't cover in the book, it, that the Spanish and the Portuguese have been doing their colonizing efforts on both continents, mostly the southern continent and the Caribbean, for over 100 years, 130 years, just about, right before the 1619 project, before the English arrive. And so, just by framing a book as the 1619 project, it already puts us in a kind of relationship with English Euro-Christians, as I call them. But there's, of course, French Euro-Christians and Portuguese Euro-Christians and Spanish Euro-Christians, right? And just like they didn't necessarily always distinguish between Narragansett natives and Wampanoag natives, for example, and know all of the cultural nuances, just as they all have different cultures. They all share the same kind of religious ideals that they use to say that they can take land from native people, right? So from a view from the shore is not going to really, if somebody's coming in to try and dominate you religiously, it's not going to matter the difference so much between Protestant and Catholic, although that might be a really big deal to the Europeans, right? But they're still Euro-Christian underneath. So that's again why I use that adjective lowercase all the time. We're not talking about a different religious sect, although that's information that we might bring to more nuanced analyses. We're talking about a worldview that the colonizers bring. And then that by naming that thing, it gives us a little bit more of a kind of conceptual room to think about, well, what would this mean for native people, right? So that's where another way of talking about the view from the shore. Um, Setting my volume there. So a view from the shore sees invasion rather than discovery, right? And an invasion is not something to necessarily be celebrated. A view from the shore is unaware of European politics, Christianity, power hierarchies, or their metaphysics. A view from the shore sees newcomers within a broadly interconnected trade system based on a gift exchange economy. So many native nations have a gift economy that spreads throughout the entire North American continent. And the Euro Christians were not able to see that because they couldn't conceive of trade working that way, and because they're working with a different kind of economy. And then their historians aren't able to track that, right? So this is what like later historical work and later contact and like more emphasis on existing native peoples who still are around, of course, today, help native scholars help us understand better better what was going on from different people's perspectives in the 1600s here. So English Euro Christians were participants in the gift economy through the entire colonial era, and the Americans after the revolutions, if we're going to call the Euro Christians Americans now, to a lesser extent after the revolution, are still in some gift relationships with some native groups. Uh, and so we could look at maps I'm always want to emphasize international context. So multiple European powers, they're all Christian, like I said, all lay claims to the Americas. Their claims to having the power to make claims comes from their theological disposition, despite what their culture is, despite what their language is, and despite what their increasingly what their sectarian um, uh, ideologies are with respect to the breakup of the Catholic Church into the Protestant churches and the sects that break off from various sects of Protestantism. So when we look at the map of the powers that be, at least from the European powers coming over to the continent, I like this map, but it doesn't always give the dates for the voyagers. So we've got Columbus here in the dotted line. Um, I'm going to be focusing on the east coast of what's currently the United States over here. So what we see is Verrazzano, who is an Italian explorer, captain, navigator, but working for France. Comes over and does the discovery work. Remember, discovery is a formal process that's a legal process of claiming lands for Christendom, right? It's not just like I invented something. Although when we think about patent laws and intellectual property today, and why there are laws around it, that it does have this older history that goes back to like things like Doctrine of Discovery. So Giovanni de Verrazzano set sail on his North American voyage in 1524, almost 100 years before 1619 project, right? And he claims it for France. Now, John Cabot, who had already claimed up here, this dotted line for England, had already claimed the northeast coast for England, right? Which creates a potential conflict between the French and the English. I'll say more about that as we go on because we're going to see it emerge later on in a later lecture with the Seven Years' War or the so-called French Indian War. That the tensions around conflicts over doctrine of discovery are at root for that conflict. Um, so he departs from the Madeira Islands off the coast of Portugal. He first sights land near Cape Fear in present-day North Carolina. His notable quote discovery again is the New York Harbor. Um, Jumping to the 1530s, so Verrazzano is working for France, Jacques Cartier is working for France, and he takes trips in the 1530s down the St. Lawrence River, and he's going to meet these various groups, Wyandotte or Wendat, sometimes called Huron, but generally Wyandotte is the preferred term as far as I know these days. Uh, so he's going to meet different groups down the St. Lawrence River, and they're going to have different interactions with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who I've talked about a little bit in class, and we'll talk about more in this lecture. Then we've got, of course, in 1585, the failed Roanoke colony from the English. That's the first one that the English try. Doesn't work. Then they get Jamestown a little bit further north in 1607. But if we take the international perspective, again, what's not happening here, but gets us closer to that view from the shore, like from the native perspective, like Europeans and these invading peoples have been coming from various different places, and trade networks are spreading the news about these different peoples, right? And so there had been, like I said, more than 100 years of contact. So if we look at Spanish claims just on North America, so I'm going to leave the southern continent out of it, although there's a little bit of Mexico, Central America that might play into today's talk. Um, if we look at Ponce de Leon, the Fountain of Youth guy, um, is exploring La Florida, as they called it, in 1513. He lands on the northeast coast of Florida between April 2nd and April 8th. The Spanish colony of St. Augustine, which is still a city, or St. Augustine, Florida, is established in 1565. So about 20 years before the first English colony that's failed. Um, Spanish explorer Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles landed on the shores of Florida and named the settlement after St. Augustine, a Christian saint. That's that process of discovery. What do? You baptize the land in the name of something related to Christendom, in this case, a saint. Just as Columbus did with renaming the island of Guanahani, San Salvador, and then renaming what's now today Dominican Republic, New Spain or Hispaniola. And then that we get the whole concept of New Spain emerging over into Central America, Mexico. We can look at De Soto's voyages from the 1530s, not covered in 1619 project, and this is important because it's a devastating impact on existing native populations that spreads throughout the continent in terms of spreading disease, in terms of all enslavement and violence, um, uh, and it drastically was already altering many Native American societies on the continent, but further interior. And if we only have that kind of pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock narrative or something, then we don't really get that there's a lot more going on, and that natives have networks that go from down to Florida all the way into South America, all the way up into Canada. We know that. We know that that's all way, way before even um, uh, Christopher Columbus, right? Like there's trade across both continents, and it happens with agriculture especially. And I'll show you some stuff at the very end of lecture today on that. So, De Soto's voyages, I give you a map here. He dies during the voyage, but one of his crew members, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, has a narrative, and it's a great. I don't have it in my hands; it's in my office at school. But you can order it. You can read it online. I think the Library of Congress has a web page where you can read a version of it. He notes in his narrative that even when DeSoto people land here over here in the interior Gulf Coast of Florida, we they meet other Europeans who've been stranded from shipwrecks and things like this. So they're not exactly the first. And among them, Cabeza de Vaca does note that there is an African who is probably an enslaved African through Portuguese or Spanish ships. But the fact that we have an eyewitness account to an African being on the continent, then I just again like I really like the 1619 project, and yes, it's true that in lots of ways that we can trace like that first boatload of African captives, right, who are enslaved, as arriving and starting what becomes this gross form of chattel slavery that really does emerge in New England. But if we're talking about Africans being on the continent, there are a few earlier on, probably still enslaved by the Spanish, and yet then they end up like the crews sort of fall apart, and the Europeans find themselves mixing with native peoples. So lots of different versions of that kind of thing, right? Where a failed attempt, or sometimes Europeans decide willingly to join native peoples and just mix among them because there isn't a concept of that kind of racism going on. That's a much later kind of thing. And then again, so I mentioned that Mexico might show a little bit of, and the point here is that like 1519-ish, when Hernan de Cortez and that they're going in and taking Tenochtitlan, or the Aztec capital, right down to current day Mexico City. That's where they set up a shop of relations, and then they learn Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and then they go down and they start dominating the Mayan people in Guatemala, down the west coast of Guatemala. And so even if you go to Guatemala today, you can see that by the town names, you can see that same colonizing process. You'll see the towns ending with that TL kind of thing, on the kind of northwestern Guatemala, whereas I don't know, a town like um, Chichicastenango up in the mountains, for example, is a Mayan name. And they're all Mayan places, like Mayan people dominate all of the places. But you see that the Spanish learned a native language and still use the Spanish practices of domination, just using Nahuatl as the language there. So they have a base of operations down there. And it's actually Cabeza de Vaca, that guy from De Soto's voyage. He eventually makes his way and meets other Spanish colonizers and makes his way down to Mexico, and that's how he survives from that. that voyage. If we look at around the same time, Coronado's expedition, which is likely like somebody who some of that expedition is who Cabeza de Vaca or someone like him might meet some of these kinds of folks who are going up north. Um, we see that Coronado maneuvers through what's current day New Mexico, Arizona, um, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, right? So just looking at that voyage, that's going to become important here because we see that in 1580 there's a Pueblo revolt. So the stock story is often like, oh, the Europeans came and they just dominated people and like the natives are victims or something like that. But that's not really true. We see the natives winning a revolt early on in 1580, and what are they revolting against? They're revolting um, and it reoccurs in 1680 and 1850, they are revolting particularly against the imposition of Christianity by on the natives. So Spanish priests were suppressing native practices that they deemed inconsistent with Christianity, and so what you might call the word religion is weird to apply to native contexts for complex reasons that I can't go into in this lecture. But yes, the religious leaders of the Pueblos finally get together and they're like, if it's only going to be these people's way, then they have to go. And so the Spanish also were demanding tribute and labor from the Pueblo people, and the Pueblo people just had enough, and so they have a revolt. They kill all of the priests, and they drive the rest of the Spanish out, and they keep the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years. And what does that do? It preserves those cultures. It preserves Zuni culture, various Puebloan cultures down there. Although the Pueblo is a Spanish word, it just means village, right? Um, so there are many different indigenous groups that are living in the area, and they're able to hold on to their cultures for longer. If we think about it again, the view from the land, like the native groups that are holding the Europeans at bay for centuries on the East Coast help to preserve the cultures like where I live here in Denver, Colorado, where we have Cheyenne and Arapaho people who've also had put their own faced their own issues with colonialism for sure, and the brutal colonialism, but language and culture is more intact sometimes for like Lakota people, because it happens much later, right? Yes, we still get the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 or early 1890s, and we'll talk about that in later lectures. But so it's not to diminish the fact that there's brutality of conquest, but we want to, if we have a view from the shore, then we want to see how there's resistance from the beginning, and the resistance persists today. Um, let's see. The Pueblo Revolt also for a while keeps the Spanish out of North America for a while, right? Like, what if they hadn't revolted, right? You could see the Spanish occupying more and more of what's today the southwest of the United States. Now, I know the United States goes and steals it illegally in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe against all international law at the time. We'll get to that later on as well. But again, the native cultures are preserved because the Puebloans revolt. So back to the East Coast now, getting to the big events for a first year history class from the 1600s. First of all, when we look at Verrazano's narrative, that guy Italian explorer working for the French, Verrazano notes in 1524, he sees fields that extend 25 to 30 leagues. They're open and free. This is a direct quote from him. And in translation, of course, they are open and free of any obstacles or trees, and so fertile that any kind of seed would produce excellent crops. The statement reveals horticultural practices and population in the tens of thousands among Narragansetts and Wampanoags, who would later be at war with one another. Could be that enmity arose over contact with European traders. It could be the enmity between Narragansett and Wampanoags has to do with diseases affecting their populations that the Europeans had brought. Um, there are a lot of complex ways to think about it if we were going to zero in more. Verrazano also notes that Indians didn't know what their weapons were, but merely seemed curious of their craftsmanship. That's exactly like what Columbus encountered in the Caribbean, right? The natives don't know what metal is. They cut their hand on it. Well, they just don't know what the weapons are. So every time that Euro Christians want to talk about the brutal Indians who were all savage and killing each other before they got here, we need to maybe rethink what's going on and the biases that create that kind of narrative that becomes the stock story, right? Um, can't be that brutal if they don't have the kinds of weapons that the Europeans have. Um, does that mean that there was never a murder on the entire continent, before Europeans arrived here or something like that? No, obviously not, right? That's like we've got to use some common sense here, but it is not the kind of warfare and brutality that the Euro Christians are used to fighting amongst each other or fighting against Muslims or fighting against Genghis Khan. That kind of stuff is not happening in to the extent here that it was happening over in Eurasia. So the Wampanoags first received European contact in 1524 with Verrazano, and they deal with voyagers intermittently throughout the entire century. But by 1602, there was yearly contact from English sailors, especially. And so the natives by then had already like they learned some English. There's a lot more going on. It's not like when the sort of called pilgrims arrive at Plymouth Rock that the natives don't know who they are. Um, the natives might be worried about who them because they know to worry. Um, Wampanoags received them 1602. From 1602, we have see yearly contact. In 1602, uh, and with Gosnold in 1603, Martin Pring says that the Wampanoags were eager for trade, and when he got tired of them, he let loose his giant mastiffs to run them off. So that says something about how the English were engaging with natives, right? Because he says like, oh yeah, I'm trading with them and now I'm getting tired of them asking for more and more stuff, and so I'm just going to stick my dogs on them. In 1611, the Wampanoags are no longer friendly with the English. I wonder why, if they're sticking their dogs on them after trading, right? 1614, this guy named Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, native guy, gets captured by Thomas Hunt among scores of other Wampanoags. So there's enslavement is already happening, right? By like 1614, for native peoples being taken. And well before that, the Spanish are going in and taking native peoples and taking them through the Caribbean or taking them back to Europe. Um, Thomas Hunt captures him. There's other Indians. Indian enslavement by Europeans had been going on for more than a century. More than despite the 1542 Spanish law against it. So there is a Spanish law against enslavement of natives because they should become Christianized first. So there's a whole debate going on in the 1540s called the Valladolid debate. We've talked a little bit in class about Bartolomé de las Casas, and that's that debate about whether or not to what extent native peoples of the Americas are fully human. That's all going on, but enslavement is happening anyway, right? And all a conquistador has to do is provoke the Indians into snapping back at him for whatever reason, and then he can claim a just war against Christianity, or he can say, well, they didn't follow the requerimiento, like they didn't convert. Well, I told them, I gave them the choice to convert, but they didn't, and so that they're not converting justifies taking them their land and enslaving them. So um, uh, the trust with the Wampanoags is completely destroyed by 16, especially, I mean, it was already happening, between 1602 and 1614. The Wampanoags are not necessarily in a good relationship with the English folks. So first in Spain and then in England, um, uh, sorry, Tisquantum is taken first to Spain and then to England, and he lives very close, like within blocks, maybe that we call them today, of Pocahontas. Her real name is Mataoaka, and they probably met each other. We just don't have an account of that. So she's there living as Lady Rebecca in 1619, going to Shakespeare plays at the Globe Theater. That is a political marriage that she has with John Rolfe and not John Smith, like the Disney the stories show. Um, and so yeah, she's on a diplomatic mission. She dies of disease pretty a few years after that. So Tisquanto or Squanto, Tisquantum returns in 1619 and knows some English. And so he is the one who comes out and meets the so-called pilgrims, as the Euro-Christians call them. A plague had happened in what is now New England. It had devastated the Wampanoag groups, and there are different groups, subgroups within the term Wampanoag. But in the Charter of New England, in the pre-contact chapters of Plymouth Plantation, which are interesting reads if you're interested in this stuff, Indigenous people were already depicted as being brutish murderers who fighting amongst one another and represented as having killed each other off. Historian Francis Jennings notes that as early as 1588, English speculators of colonization noticed that the natives began to, quote, die very fast after contact with English people. Deaths of indigenous people by disease in the Euro-Christian cognitive schema was interpreted as God clearing the land for them. If they were due to if they were to do some killing too, this will be in accordance with their theological worldview of God's plan. Every time they kill native peoples, if they're successful, it's because God wanted them to do it to begin with. Notice that I use all lowercase. That's just the way that I write in my book with my Wasatch Osage colleague, Tink Tinker, right? So I'm aware of the lack of capitalization in my writing here. Um, if thus, even claims that disease accounted for much of the body count among indigenous people, it demonstrates a kind of casuistry or a case-based reasoning of turning genocide into sacrifice, so embedded within Euro-Christian cognitive frames. Indigenous people in this view were being sacrificed by God and Euro-Christians alike, and such thinking is directly in line with a providential locus, the idea that it's the God's plan, right, for these people to come in and invade and kill other people. And that goes back as far as St. Augustine's theory of just war, which is of course embedded in the doctrine of discovery. So, people talk about like native genocide and early killings and like there's of course the disease. Oh, it's just disease that killed it. It's like that's we need to make that more complex. And then like, well, they didn't really mean to do it. We note that I've already noted that they know that the disease is happening. They notice the depopulation happening, and yet they still come. And then Francis Jennings, who's a good scholar of this stuff, points to Richard Hakluyt. There are a couple of different guys named Richard Hakluyt, Hakluyt, who, but one of them's a lawyer. It's the lawyer being referenced here. Clearly states the intentions for the Virginia colony of 1585, the one that fails. He says, our goals are the ends of this voyage are these. One, to plant the Christian religion. Number one is always the Christian religion. To traffic, to traffic humans, to trade with goods, to traffic whatever, to do commerce, right? To conquer or to do all three. The primary source reveals that there's an intent among the English to vilify the savage. The word savage just means like woods person. It means boundaries. Selvage is a different word, and so like in French, sauvage, the word means like is sometimes translated to wild person or something like that. But we note that the English, and Francis Jennings does this in his book, the English especially take that word that just means wild or of the woods, and they make it seem like something really evil. And so in English, there's this connotation of the word savage as being particularly brutal or brutish, animal-like. Um, we know that John Smith of the Pocahontas legend noted in 1614 that the East Coast was so well planted with gardens and cornfields and so well inhabited with goodly, strong, and well-proportioned people that he judged it an excellent place for health and fertility. And of all the four parts of the world, I've not yet seen not inhabited by Europeans. He extolled, could I have but the means to transport a colony, I would rather live here than anywhere else in the world. So again, this is corroborates with Verrazano in 1524, right? Like 90 years earlier. It's not like the natives weren't planting stuff. They have gardens, they have cornfields. Life is good over there. People aren't starving. Um, and it's beautiful. That's the source here is David Silverman's book. I think that's a really good book on the history of Thanksgiving. Uh, International context again matters for me. There's a 12-year truce back in the European international context, right? So back on in Europe, there's a 12-year truce that's happened between Netherlands Protestants and Catholic Spain. If you know people like Baruch Benedict Spinoza, the famous philosopher, he's a Sephardic Jew. The Jews get ousted from Spain between 1490 and 1492. They all go to Portugal. They become conversos. They either convert to Christianity or they're expelled. Many convert in name only, but a lot of the Sephardic Jews from that area of the world end up going up into the Netherlands. Um, the Netherlands is considered a place of a little bit more religious tolerance and freedom. But there's a tension between Protestants and Catholic Spain that's going to go back to that Protestant Reformation from 1517 on. So there was a peace that was supposed to end in 1621, or a truce anyway. And that was going to be renegotiated. So the Pilgrims, the people that most Americans know as the Pilgrims anyway, were living mostly in the Netherlands, and they're anticipating this Catholic powers coming back in and possible conflict. They don't want to go back to England because the state religion in England is the Anglican Church. They're more extreme Protestants. And so their interests also are in economic. They join forces with the Virginia Company, as I say here, but we can't really separate out from their minds politics and religion or economic interests and religion. It's all part of the same worldview. Pilgrims made a deal with Thomas Weston of the Virginia Company to transport them under the Virginia title with the exchange that they would produce goods in the new land for the company. So yeah, we will go set up a plantation, but we're going to be in an economic relationship with the Virginia company to sell our wares and goods and whatever we've traded with native peoples to create wealth for ourselves. Um, of course, they don't arrive in Virginia. They arrive north, and in what is now Massachusetts, um, and Plymouth Rock and all of that stuff. They arrive into empty villages that had been emptied out by that plague that I mentioned from the 16 teens, and they encounter very quickly that guy Squanto, who already knows some English, and then word gets very quickly to a Wampanoag or Pokanoket, that's a sub branch of Wampanoag leader named, and the leader is Sachem or Massasoit. So sometimes people refer to Usamakan as as Massasoit, but Massasoit is it's like a title. So that word chief comes from the French word chef, mean or like head, like boss in French. But the local leaders were called sachems or Massasoit here. He arrives after the English land. He arrives with 60 troops within an hour of Squanto's first conversation with the English. A plague, as I already said, had recently devastated the region, which is why the English find empty villages and some food stores. They immediately start taking it for themselves. They also rob graves looking for goods. So like that's the first thing. If you're thinking about like what natives see, is people coming and overtaking empty villages of your relatives who've recently died. It's considered a hands-off kind of place, getting the stores of food and actually opening up their graves, right? Can you imagine that that might be kind of offensive? If it were to happen to you, like somebody just starts digging up the graveyard down the street. Um, but he ends up being one of the main leaders in dealing with the English. There are many different native groups, right? So he's not like king of all of the land or something like that. Although that name king gets applied to them because that's what the Euro Christians know. They know hierarchies of classes of people, and they bestow that wrongly onto indigenous contexts because they don't know the culture. He dies in 1661, and it's partly because of his death that there's that this a lot of the truce and the pieces that had been held up until that time shifts. First, one of his sons takes over for him, but he dies pretty quickly. And then we get Metacom, and that's where we're going to get Metacom's War, which is kind of what I'm building up to. So, what we see here with the Wampanoag country in the 1600s is all of these different groups, and they've got like on this map, the English names beneath them, so that if you're wanting to kind of bring your mind back into so Patuxet, Plymouth over in here, they land over in Cape Cod over here. It's just not on the map right over here, and then they quickly come into Patuxet. That Patuxet is the village that I was just mentioning that was emptied out. Um, They claim that they're coming for Christendom, and they do claim that they're converting natives. But as Francis Jennings, among others, note that there's not a lot of like despite there's a lot of rhetoric seeking to Christianize Indians, actual conversions were rare in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Oftentimes, as Linford Fisher's book, The Indian Great Awakening, attests, natives in North America embraced forms of Christianity as a practical strategy just to get rid of white missionaries who are attempting to convert them. Like, okay, okay, I convert, now get out of here, right? So, strangely, like their counterparts in South America, and New England Euro Christians were consistently doubtful that their missionary work had ever been effective with the natives. So it creates this kind of feedback loop. Like, did they convert? Are they seriously enough? Did they backslide? And in South America, this happens especially where it's like every time a new generation of natives is born, it's like the Catholics in the, theologians and priests and friars. It, uh, see this kind of backsliding Indian. It's like, oh, they're going back into the forest sort of thing. So now we've got to double down and we've got to re-evangelize them over and over again. And it creates that kind of cycle that that's like you need to have like the backsliding wild or savage Indian, which is like a transformation of the way that you might think of how like Catholic culture might have been in English in European Christendom, where it's like you're just baptized at birth, right? It's like and later on, the Protestants come up with like no, you have like Baptists are like no, you have to acknowledge as an adult, you have to fully acknowledge your conversion to being saved and that sort of stuff. Anabaptists as well. So a lot of different theological views. But the natives are definitely being treated differently. Like even if they're saved, it seems like the English don't believe that they're saved, and maybe they're really not, you know. We know from my earlier lecture on slave codes that, like, if you spoke up in church, if you argued with the priest, if you made fun or heckled the priest, that would be grounds for being, after 1641, for being put to death. Or most likely, what was being happening, it would be grounds for being sold into slavery. Um, so Tinker details a lot of this in his book Missionary Conquests, uh, as well. It's a really, really good book. It's still one of the best books on the period, if you ask me. People were coming from England already with an apocryphal stories about savage Indians. So they're coming with this idea that Indians are savage, but the people who've actually been there are saying, like, look at these big fields of corn and agriculture. This is the best place on earth. So going back, so that was New England, right? Now we go down to Virginia. And so that's setting up what will become Metacom's War. Now pop down to Virginia. I've covered this a little bit in some of my classes already, so some of this might be repeat information if you come to face class. Um, uh, there was so Virginia colony is not the Puritans, it's not the Pilgrims. They're still Anglican, they're still Euro-Christian, but it's a different context. And so under George Yardley's leadership, friendly relationships with the Chickahominy Indians deteriorate. The Jamestown is unable to supply itself instead devoting land and labor to the cultivation of tobacco. The Chickahominy Indians are sometimes unable to supply food, the colony with food. So this is part of the problem down in Virginia is that you have these people who've come to grow and make a lot of money off of tobacco, and they're not planting enough food to take care of themselves, but they're expecting the native people and their trade with the native people to give them food, and that's not always something that can happen. And so it creates conflict with the surrounding native folks. It also creates like the desire for more and more land to grow more and more tobacco. And for bonded servants, but an indentured servant, you could get out of your bonds and then you would expect land, or maybe you're working to get land and then make money as a free person on your own. So as land becomes more scarce, at the same time, there's more of a labor shortage. Um, English or European bonds people can get out of that later on, can get out of bond service. So it incentivizes people to create a kind of permanent servant system where people can't get out of servitude so that they can't ever claim land for themselves, too, right? And that is where we get 1619 and the Africans being imported, although slavery and the slave codes is a longer process. Of course, slavery it becomes legal in 1641 up north in Massachusetts Bay Colony, but we see the first slave codes being really put in place in the 1660s. So in Virginia and Barbados and Jamaica and the other English colonies. So going back to this guy Yardley, um, Governor Yardley. Uh, 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 the Chickahominy Indians they get frustrated, they grow impatient, and Yardley's response is to take a group of men and kill 20 to 40 Chickahominy Indians and say that you're going to give us food or whatever we ask for. And so as a result, the tribe draws closer to the Powhatan Confederation down in Virginia. The company then fails to win a monopoly in a tobacco trade from the crown. And this is partly because James I doesn't like smoking. But the tobacco trade had gotten really, really huge, and lots of money was being made from tobacco for a while. But this conflict with James I means that they don't get a monopoly, they can't control their prices, and so the prices of tobacco completely drop. There's an economic crisis in the tobacco crop around 1619, 1620, and exactly that time when the Africans are coming, captives are being brought into the bay for trade. So like, how are you going to get basically free labor, people that you don't have to pay for? You're going to like make up like slavery, right? Like servitude that you no one can ever get out of. Tobacco exports grow over the next 10 years, though, from a total of 2,500 pounds in 1616 to over 50,000 pounds in 1628, just to give you a sense of the growth of the product. In London, the company creates a subsidiary joint stock company called the Magazine. And this happens a lot under emergent capitalism, right? You've got one company, which is a bunch of investors that want a return on their profit from a plantation or something like that. But then some of them get together and set up another company that sells the farmers all of the gear and the supplies and puts them into a kind of credit debt relationship. Like, we'll give you the supplies so that you can grow your crops, but now you're in debt. Now you're in debt to us. So when you get paid from the dividends from the other stock company, or you get paid for what you sell in terms of your tobacco crop, then the capitalists back in England are making money at both ends, and it creates this debt servitude relationship with, especially with Virginia farmers, and that goes all the way through George Washington. That's like a big part of his struggle, even after marrying Martha Washington, is an economic struggle against rapacious kind of capitalist endeavors back in London, who are just like kind of taking the poor farmers for everything that they're worth. And that resentment definitely contributes to the Revolutionary War. But later from where we're at in historical time in this lecture. So that different companies here, almost completely independent. It does receive a monopoly in supplying Jamestown with the outlying settlements with gear, with tools, things like this, guns. Its director and courts meet separately from the Virginia companies, and the profits are returned to its investors alone. So again, like money is being made, but money is being held back in England. And that is a resentment that will just continue to grow. So from Jamestown in 1616, we see that there's an ending the first 7-year period. The Virginia Company attempts to issue dividends to its investors, but profits are so small that it distributes land instead in Virginia. The company allows for the establishment of private plantations called hundreds. Land grants are given to several of the company's major adventurers. Thereafter, some people buy stock in the Virginia Company for the specific purpose of getting private land grants. After 1618, English settlement significantly encroaches on the Indian lands, but they also need more people to work those lands, hence bringing in more bonded servants and slaves eventually. Um, After 1618, the English settlement significantly encroaches on Indian lands, especially along the Chickahominy and James rivers. Most of these encroachments are due to private land grants by the company. Got a citation there for you. This is a picture of Lady Rebecca or Matawaka, also Pocahontas. She is a political leader. Women have political power in the indigenous communities. Like the that term Pocahontas is a diminutive. It's like calling her little girl or something like that. So her name is Matawaka. She anglifies her name to Lady Rebecca. She marries John Rolfe to create a truce. She dies while over in England, as I said earlier, and then we get a second war. So there's a first Powhatan War. Remember, like the the native folks are not, they know to be wary of the English folks, right? But then a truce gets established, and then we get a 1622 war. Again, it's like after Matawaka has passed away. We get 1644, another war, and this guy William Barclay comes in, and he becomes a kind of war hero, captures um, Opechancanough, who's an uncle to Matawaka or Pocahontas, who dies in captivity, killed by a settler who was supposed to guard him. So the settler's supposed to guard this guy who would be considered politically important, if not even like deserving of some sort of asylum. But this important leader is killed by just the guy who's guarding him. So a treaty in 1646 is then established. Barclay here has a monopoly on fur trade from tributary Indians at the time. Uh, and and falls out of favor again after the Second Anglo-Dutch War. So sometimes he's a war hero, sometimes people resent him, but he's got a lot of power and he's got a monopoly on the trade with the native peoples. So he's making bank from trading in furs while everybody else is trying to get plantations going. You've got a resentment. The people, money is being hoarded back in England. So what happens is in 1666, 76, and 77, we get Bacon's rebellion in Jamestown. And it emerges when poor white bond servants and African servants, slaves at this time, band together and want to overthrow the ruling classes. The context here is that there are Doeg Indians in 1675 who kill settlers for encroaching and destroying cattle and corn, too. Two militias form. One kills 10 Doegs and another kills 14 friendly Susquehannocks because the English are not discriminating between one group of native peoples and another. So that creates enmity with Susquehannocks. But then Governor Barclay says, oh, well, the Susquehannocks, they were in league with the Doeg anyway. Then a Maryland militia is formed, 1,000-man militia led by Thomas Truman, teams up with John Washington, great grandfather of George Washington. Come back to him in a minute. And Isaac Allerton of the Virginia militia, they invite five chiefs to parley, and instead of talking with them, they kill them. So that's some diplomacy for you. They kill them without trial because they say some of the men are wearing items of clothing from the murdered settlers. Others say they could have gotten them in trade. Others say it's made up. We probably won't ever know the end of that whole conflict. 1676, we see the Susquehannocks retaliate, and then we see Nathaniel Bacon's request for militia to drive Indians out of Virginia. So he wants to drive all of the Indians out of Virginia. And Barclay denies him. So Bacon forms his own militia made up of settlers. So you've got Barclay, who's kind of ruling class, who's denying Bacon the ability to form a militia because Bacon wants to genocide all native peoples in Virginia. So Bacon gets together with poor whites and African slaves and creates a revolution, or sorry, not a revolution, but a revolt against the ruling classes. And he writes a declaration to the people in July of 1676, 100 years before 1776. And yet, what we see in that kind of act of writing down your grievances and stating them before you're doing what you're doing, it sets up a kind of palette, or it is a kind of precursor for what Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence. I've already gone over this in some classes, and you have the slides if you're in my classes, so I'm not going to go over all of these points by point. But it's just to note that you want to compare Bacon's Declaration of the People to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence 100 years later. It's during this period that the name Conaticarius, or town destroyer, which is a Seneca or Onondaga term, gets applied to John Washington for his role in the Maryland Virginia rampages against natives during Bacon's Rebellion. Tanarcison, later on, or Tanagrason, half king, is sometimes what he's called, applies the name to George Washington in 1753 when George Washington is surveying in the Ohio Valley, because the natives in Ohio Valley remember his great grandfather from back in Maryland and Virginia so I guess like 3 generations prior. So that tells us something about how natives communicate with each other despite across nations, international communication, and says something about memory, native memory for different for the Euro-Christian peoples. Okay, so we went to Virginia and now and talked about Bacon's Rebellion. Yes, it's this like great, like kind of in some ways democratic, like precursor to democracy, where like the lower classes are getting or revolting against the ruling class, except that what they want to do by banding together is to genocide all of the natives. So you got to like put it all into perspective. Metacom, then we see um, showing up, or King Philip's War happens at the same time as Bacon's Rebellion, but up north in Massachusetts. And so want to go into that context. Okay, so the stock story, of course, is the Euro-Christian story. The Puritan Christians and earlier the Pilgrims, they all are looking for religious freedom. That's all they want is just religious freedom. They want to flee the yoke of King James. They make a deal with the Virginia Company, made up of Anglican Christians and ruffians, but they land in Cape Cod instead of in Virginia, and so they have the Mayflower Compact, which is the early form of banding together in democracy and religious freedom. They spark the first tendencies towards a democratic rule. They have a rough time at first, but with some help from the Indians, they're able to plant their crops and hold a Thanksgiving feast in 1621. Wars between native groups, they're just savages who are fighting against each other, and they perceive the English as a rival. It's not their fault. The Puritans, through conflict and conversions and land sales, establish a quote New England under the charter of King James, establishing a proxy government and establishing a settler colony. Ultimately, the Indians accept their subjection, and Euro Christians give them civilization in exchange for land. So it's not that the Indians aren't paid, they're paid by becoming civilized and becoming Christian. Lands not governed by a Christian prince may and should be claimed for Christendom, whether Protestant or Catholic, under Doctrine of Discovery. Indians have no religion and they need to be taught true religion. So it works out for everybody in the stock story, right? Land sales are conducted through dealing with sachems or chiefs. And of course, 1619, we get the first African slaves. Let's think about the counter story. I'm going to take an international context, but for international from on the continent of native peoples. Haudenosaunee Confederacy is one of many alliances and groups that at times, I've got a map here, an early map, and we can see their reach going all the way um, out to the Atlantic Ocean, but they would still have trade relationships with the people that become like people further east, the Wampanoags and Narragansetts and folks like that. So the trade relationships cross over. There are some imbalances, like there's a gift-based economy that spreads throughout the continent, and different confederacies or groups of natives have gotten together. And there are power differences between different groups. There are expectations of trade and how trade alliances happen. So you've got new Europeans coming in, and they inevitably shake up the gift economy balance. For example, just one example, Wyandots or Wendots, aka Hurons, but that's not a term that's used so much these days. Um, Lake Huron is up there though. But for example, sometimes the Wyandots are sided with the French against Haudenosaunee and said the Haudenosaunee are oppressing us, trade weapons and only give the rifles and things like that to us, and then we can go fight our oppressors. So we see conflicts like that arising. We'll see more of that. I mentioned that particular disagreement because we're going to see different alliances of natives when we get to the Seven Years' War or the French and Indian War. And it's because of the disruption of the trade networks and stuff that it creates resentment and to claim that all natives are one thing or all natives are Indians. That's such a weird term in some ways, right? Because they're different groups of people have different needs and make different political alliances even among and within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, right? So at the same time, archaeologists like have found a Portuguese hand axe from the late, it would be I think the 1500s, but the design is from the late 1400s. I've got a quote a few slides down from Jace Weaver on that. They have found hand axes way up here that are Portuguese made from the late 1400s, early 1500s. So we know that it got buried, and so the radiocarbon dating and stuff shows that when the hand axe was buried, so that it was traded way far up north, way early on before the English were really hanging out or coming over. So it tells us that trade is happening down into the Caribbean and to Florida, um, maybe even South America if we're talking Portuguese, right? It's just an interesting artifact. Counter story again, Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This is their flag. This is their wampum showing their confederacy. Gift economies require balance and reflect American Indian worldview, different than Euro-Christian worldview, right? Fundamentally based on balance. Barbara Mann, who is Seneca or Onondaga scholar, highlights the number of two within the within American Indian worldview in her book, Spirit of Blood, Spirits of Breath. Wampum is used throughout the religion and is the New England currency from 1637 to 1661. In 1673, it's used as currency in New York because it goes from Amsterdam to New England. Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Uh, I have a date here that I'm just sort of going as a median here, 1190 current era. Some people date it later. Some people date it as far back as 950 current era. So I've got that on another slide. Like right here, some data as old as 950, others in the 1400s. Generally, what we see over time, the is that with more and more scholarship and information, we're able to backdate a lot of dates with, including when native peoples arrive on the continents to begin with, right? Going back to like, um, you know, arguments over Bering Strait theories and things that we just can't cover in this class. So the Iroquois Confederacy is the name of the French, but it's Haudenosaunee is the local term. They trace their foundation to a prophet named known as the Peacemaker, and with the help of Ianwatha, or later on Hiawatha, um, forge a bond between first five nations and later Tuscarora joined them as a sixth nation. The exact date and time of the joining is unknown, but it's as I've said, but it's said to be time immemorial. And you could look into their own stories for how and why the nations get together. It's made up of Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, and was intended as a way to unite nations and create peaceful means of decision making. Through the Confederacy, each of the nations of the Haudenosaunee are united by a common goal to live in harmony. Each nation maintains its own council with chiefs chosen by a clan mother and deals with its own internal affairs, but the Grand Council deals with affecting nations within the Confederacy. I'm not going to read this whole slide out, but asking the clan mothers of each tribe to be present to present their chiefs, he placed deer antlers. This is the peacemaker placed deer antlers on each of their heads to symbolize their authority to the five nations. The Mohawks had nine chiefs of the bear, and I just go on here with this. You can go to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's own homepage here to talk about, like, first of all, we want to notice that there's an interaction between women and men, that their clan mothers make the ultimate decisions, but then there's a whole democratic process that follows after that. So deciding on who gets to become Descahe, which is a localized term for chief. Remember, chief is a French word. To the Confederacy, if I draw this, go back to a map that has a bunch of people's names on it, different nations, then we see that the Tuscarora join after 1722, so it goes from five to six nations. The Lenape joined for a little while in 1676, and they join as women. So a nation can be women. There's a famous book or good book called A Nation of Women by Gunlag Fur, which you might go into. So like the Europeans do not understand the gender balance that is part of American Indian worldview, especially in political relationships. Lenape separate in 1753 before the French and Indian War. So people, native groups come in and leave. There can be disagreements within the Confederacy. So if we take a longer view very quickly before coming back to the Metacom's war, um, this might change our perspective too from the stock narrative. We see a medieval warm period in 900. That causes issues on the North American continent with big complexes, um, like over in Chaco Canyon, for example, which I'll talk about more in another lecture. But we also see that the warm period creates rising temperatures in Europe. It affects Pueblo cultures over here. It affects Europe. For a while, there's a grain crops flourish and alpine trees lose or alpine tree lines rose, many new cities arose, and the population more than doubled. Sea levels rise, and the ocean is easier to navigate. The Black Plague from 1348 to 53 kills about 80%, and some say now over 90% of Europeans, and returns intermittently. It's likely that both spread east and west through Mongolian invasions. Marco Polo's travels among the Khans from 1271 to 1295 are significant for later Genoese merchants and sailors. Although the siege of Kaffa, which is current-day Crimea, a Genoese trading port in the early 1340s, does show intentional biological warfare, it is not likely that it's how the plague spread to Europe. It's likely that it was already there and jumped to humans when flea-biting rats no longer have hosts to jump to humans. Many people who lived and flourished after the plague, who lived through the plague, flourished because everybody else was gone, right? Like people could just take other people's land, other people's riches. So there was a kind of cultural renaissance, and in combination with information obtained from invading Muslim countries, the Crusades, Arabic numerals and math, Plato, and most more of Aristotle, a philosophical and artistic movement was underway as well that we now know as the Renaissance. That's a longer international perspective going on, but the Europeans know what disease is. They know what biological warfare is. And they have the cultural memory of massive devastations of their own selves. They know how to um, quarantine themselves, for example. Those practices are well in place among Europeans before coming here. So again, can't just blame things on disease. If we take the international perspective, again, Euro-Christian perspective this time, Spain's economy was one of the richest in Europe after, you know, pillaging the Incans in the and the Caribbean. Um, uh, uh, it's crumbling by the late 1500s and throughout the 1600s. They were overextended and have taken the initial spoils all that they can. So they made a bunch of money, but then that now they can't keep hold of their spoils of their lands. So there are devastating religious wars in Europe from the Protestant Reformation with tolls exceeding between 6.5 and 17.5 million people. So the Christians fighting each other are brutal before coming over to the new continent. The English miraculously defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. Conflict arose over the challenges to Elizabeth I's push to Protestantism after her Catholic sister, Mary the First, or Bloody Mary, tried to reverse Henry VIII's breakup with papal authority. The push and pull in England, especially over whether or not it's going to remain a Protestant nation. A return of the plague happens in London during the 1590s. There is mandatory isolation or quarantining, which I just mentioned. There is state religion. So religion is it is the nation state religion. Um, English read Bartolome de las Casas and his critiques of Columbus, and they develop a story called the Black Legend, saying that because of Moorish blood, um, uh, had infected Spanish people, so Muslim blood had infected Spaniards and made them unfit to govern. Emergent racism. It's going to translate into epidermic racism that Spanish people might be more tan because of their Moorish blood or like that kind. But what you see here is that the Moorish blood initially, even the idea of blood, is being attached to Muslims, and it's being attached, and that there's something naturally superior about Christians, and particularly white Christians who just have a better ability to govern other people. Emergent racism, right? Skin or modern racism with skin color. Dutch East India Company emerges in 1602 and creates a significant competition for the English, and the French are trading furs and spreading disease, etc., in what's now Canada throughout the 1500s and the Great Lakes regions. If we look at the Netherlands and what they have, what their claims are in 1685 in a reprint of 1656 map of Dutch North America, over this basically the yellow part here. This already has New York going to New England on it. But just to let you know, the Dutch are around as well among the other Euro Christians. And then we get this explosion in sometimes called the First Indian War, although we might think about the Mystic Falls Massacre as well. So uh, lots of different Euro-Christian contexts going on, but particularly in New England, what we see is that Massasoit or Usamaken, who I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, dies in 1661, and with him there's a power vacuum. His first son, Wamsuta, takes over but dies in 1662. He's married to a woman named Weetamoo, a female sachem. Metacom, or King Philip, the next younger son, takes over, but it aligns with Weetamoo. It's not a marriage relationship, but it's a gender balanced relationship, right? And that is something that's not discussed enough in discussions about this or any other context with Native groups from the early period of colonialism. Um, he breaks with his father's alliance because the English have already been overrunning, so there needs to be a new agreement anyway. In 1671, as a result of some of the laws and the slave codes that have been being passed throughout the region, we see that the English are demanding that that natives can't give or have to give up their guns. So it defines a group of people and then says what they cannot do, right? That's that earlier form of racism. The term white is emerging in the law, and eventually by the early 1700s is being written into the law more actively. War breaks out in 1675 after the English execute three Wampanoag for murdering another Wampanoag. And so they say that that they should have been brought to the English authorities to be decided. But the Wampanoag are like, no, we handle crimes in our own way, and we always have. Like, who gives you the jurisdiction here, right? Various alliances between English and natives occur during the war. By the end, there's about 3,000 plus dead. It's one of the bloodiest wars in American history, especially given the population sizes at the time. 3,000 plus dead on Metacom side and 2,000 on the English ally side. The English um, almost like can't sustain themselves after that. So what I'm getting at in terms of these lectures today, thinking about Metacom's war and Bacon's rebellion, we put them together, we see that together the English, both in Virginia and New England, develop a racial coded system, both against poor whites and blacks who are banding together, but also against native peoples, right? So different results and reasons for King Philip's War. Of course, land disputes are part of it. There are new colonial laws that are trying to overtake the gift economy, so the Native Americans resent being forced into English laws. Metacom leads the war. The war was fought between a coalition of Native American tribes and English colonists. The war destroyed 17 white settlements and damaged 50 more. The war claimed the lives of over 5,000 Native Americans together, not just um, like my last slide was saying, not just Metacom, but over 5,000 and 2,500 English. The war symbolized resistance of indigenous peoples to European encroachment on their lands. So we see that there's pushback. There's always fight back. There isn't just like a passive, like we embraced Christianity. The natives like love the English, and they never fought back. Of course, they fought back. But when we compare it to Bacon's rebellion, we see more and more this coded concept that becomes part of law, where we see the word Indian showing up rather than Wampanoag or Narragansett or Haudenosaunee Confederacy. A famous captivity narrative that I'm not going to talk about much, I'm just mentioning it in passing, is Mary Rawlinson's captivity narrative. It draws on those tropes that I mentioned earlier that the Euro Christians had before coming in, even seeing natives. They already thought that they were savages, despite the fact that Verrazano and the people who had been there are saying, like, no, this is like one of the best places on the planet. So when we see the captivity narratives, you want to read them critically because they're highly edited from a Puritan perspective. And a colleague of mine, Billy Stratton, has a book called Buried in Shades of Night, which is just about exactly about that thing. So just a source for you to look at. We might also consider conflicting legal conceptions. Um, uh, Core ideas of the English system, such as corroboration of evidence and adversary procedure, graded on Indians from a Native American worldview. Like the natives didn't understand, like why after somebody gave testimony, that another native was called up to also give testimony to corroborate the evidence. That was seen as completely dishonorable and like calling somebody a liar. Like one's word was who they were. And that's not how the English see it. The English see everybody as suspect, and they see like that truth is not even like something that we can get at. We can only like compile enough evidence to say we're going to make a ruling based on what the evidence tells us. And the natives don't see things that way at all. Tribal public opinion, I say this is from that same book, served simultaneously as their greatest ally and the most profound constraint. Thomas Pownall, when serving as lieutenant governor of New Jersey, observed that indigenous peoples of the middle and northern colonies, quote, know no such thing as administrative or executive power, properly so called. They allow the authority of advice, the king of legislative authority, but there is no civil coercion. They never had one actuating power of the whole, nor any magistrate or magistrates to execute as such. So English people want to call people like Metacom king or whoever and give these titles of hierarchy, but what we're also seeing is that even other Euro Christians are saying that that's not really how things work. So, getting to the end of things here, stock story versus counter story. Stock stories relate conquest and minimize resistance of natives. Stock stories erase the continued presence of natives today who live in various groups in the United States and Canada, not to mention Central and South America. Stock stories emphasize the brutality and savageness that were emphasizing brutality and savageness, were invented by Euro Christians to justify taking land and imposing laws. Europe was more brutal by far with respect to religious wars between and among Christians. Stock stories emphasize disease as a factor, but while a factor, biological warfare had been used in Europe and Asia for a long time before contact. And you can just think of the funny Monty Python sketch of catapulting cows over castle walls. That's like spreading anthrax, right? It's there. Um, Stock stories minimize the existing population numbers of natives here. They always say like, "Oh, you're making things up. The population wasn't that big. That not that many people died." So people are always fighting over demographics. But now, new post COVID-19 data shows that the dissemination of the Black Plague in Europe was much higher than previously thought. So for more on this, you might see this. There's a great course called The Black Death, New Lessons from Recent Research. It talks about how the plague is spread. When I was referring to rats, flea biting rats moving over to people earlier, it comes from that course. Stories also downplay the fact that natives had controlled land use and that they did agriculture and farming. They downplay it to make them seem less, quote, civilized and less connected to the land or place, more nomadic or something. So it's easier to, if somebody's nomadic to begin with, just keep moving them, right? So yet agricultural products cultivated by Native Americans now provide 60% 66% of the world's food. See Jace Weaver's The Red Atlantic. So just a couple of last things here. Trade and agriculture. Jace Weaver notes that in pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere, tobacco was found from the subarctic region to southern South America. Trade and the knowledge of that spreads all the way across both continents way before Europeans come here. Chocolate, maize, coffee, tomato, hot peppers, and potatoes, known today in various regionally defined cuisines, are like tobacco, impossible to conceive without long-standing indigenous agricultural practices. The Euro-Christian schema's denial and erasure of this most basic fact is structurally part of a genocidal fabrication to say that native peoples they were not civilized enough to begin with. They've all died out, all of that kind of business. Weaver notes that hand axe radiocarbon dated between 1500 to 1530, buried in a Wendat or Wyandotte village near the present day Ontario, surfacing in 2011. It reveals well-established indigenous trade networks were available more than a century before the Wendat people were in contact with Europeans. One other great book, Marcy Norton, Sacred Gifts, Profane Pleasures. She notes that the earliest archaeological evidence of humans' use of tobacco are seeds from Peru that date from 2500 to 1800 BCE, and more directly, tubular stone pipes from Eastern North America date as early as 2000 BCE, while non-cultivated use is speculated at being 8,000 years old. In Columbus's voyages that we first see the Europeans seeing the Caribbean folks with cigars and countering tobacco. And then tobacco becomes the economy of trade. No tobacco economy, no 1619 project, no slavery economy. So we need to think about things in terms of economic forms and the way that those economic forms and greed creates the racialized relationships and contributes to power, race, and power in US history. Thank you for your attention. We'll catch up with you in future lectures. Hope you find that interesting. I find this stuff fascinating. Let's stop my share here. Have a great day, evening, morning, whenever, wherever you are.